Predatory lending here in Canada. Should we scrap 5-year term mortgages and move to 30 term like they do in the States? All this and more with our good friend and mortgage broker, Dion Begg, right after this. Yes, my friends, as promised, here we are with Mr. Dion Begg, our favorite mortgage broker. How you doing, my man?
Hey, Gary. Fantastic, man. How you doing?
Excellent. Excellent. One might say, how can you guys be doing fantastic when the market is, the sky's falling, as it were? But you know what? It's a beautiful sunny day here in Canada, and I'm happy. I got my health. I mean, what more could you ask for, right?
I think it's just a belief in a better tomorrow. That's why we all wake up in the morning, right?
A belief in better tomorrow. Okay, our podcast is now done. We'll see everybody next week.
Rebranded.
That's right. That's right. That's right. There are some interesting things coming out of the U.S. and the Canadian mortgage market follows the bond yields, and there's all sorts of crazy stuff. And I have a comment for Dion as he after he explains what bond rates and how they affect our mortgage rates and so forth. So Dion, take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a lot of us are watching the Bank of Canada and have been watching it for a very long time. And they meet, I think it's 10 times a year. So it's not every month, but pretty much every month. And so all of us for the last 18 months have been watching. And that's the Bank of Canada. And that impacts the variable rate, right? So everybody by now probably knows that. But separate to that, we have our fixed rate mortgage holders, and fixed rates exist. And they're impacted by a different thing called the bond yield. Now, if you just want to let me share screen here, Gary. So the bond yield is basically a prediction of the bond traders about where they believe the direction of the economy is going. Okay, that's what the bond yield is created from. And so even though the Bank of Canada interest rate increases only directly impact variable rates, they do invariably impact the fixed rates in the view that people have about the future, right? And so what I've got on screen here is the 5-year bond yield. And this is just a 3-month snapshot. So I just want to point that out. It's just the last 3 months. But in the last 3 months, what you've seen it do is move from around 3.3. And we broke well above 4, which was always a point of resistance that everybody was watching. And we broke through that. And earlier this month, just a couple of days ago in September, we were at over 4.3. So we moved a full 1% over these last 3 months. And anybody who's watching fixed rates has probably seen that as well, right? If I just move on to this next slide, again, it's the 5-year bond yield, but this is over a 10-year period. So over the last decade, you can see how that rate has moved. And if we go back 10 years, you can see that over here, we're starting at just under 2%. As things progressed, we very rarely broke above 2%. And then as of the last couple of years, we've been surging 2 to 3 and now above 4%. So needless to say, Gary, a lot of the people who are getting mortgages today are even more surprised today than they were 3 months ago at how high fixed rates have moved. And again, that's impacting people's decision to qualify, their ability, their affordability factor as well. And we are seeing the impact of this, again, reduce the amount of money that a person can borrow, because they need to now prove that they can manage that borrowing in today's market where rates are at least 0.5% higher than they were just 2 to 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And what's really interesting is I heard something the other day, or I was reading something the other day, and it was talking about the bond rate. And in 2008, we'll call it the real estate bubble. We can call it a bubble because now it's, a decade more later, we can really analyze the numbers down in the States. And the interesting thing there is when that bubble or that financial crisis happened, what happened with the interest rates in Canada? They went down, which created opportunity, not only locally, but across in the States. What they're saying now with this potential financial, they're not quite ready to call it another recession in the States, but they are very mindful of what's about to happen over the next 6 months. the gurus, as it were, the financiers, as it were, are suggesting that rates won't come down in the States during this time. So it'll be interesting to watch and how it affects not only the U.S. but the Canadian economy as well.
But it is exactly those same gurus that affect market sentiment about the future, including these bond traders and how they feel rates are going to be. And so they're basically agreeing with what you're saying there in that, look, if the bond yield is where it is, it means that they also believe that things are going to be higher for longer. And actually, if I just spend a minute talking about the Canadian and USA relationship in regards to interest rates and real estate, something to remember is back in 2008, when we had our global financial crisis, the US economy took a huge hit and house prices across the board dropped by about 25%. That was pretty much, and in some cases, 50% or more, right? But across the board, it was at least 25%. At the same time, Canada didn't have the same negative impact. We dropped by about 10 or 11%. So it wasn't as bad. More importantly, though, is the recovery. So while it took the US somewhere around 8 to 10 years to get back to the numbers that they were at prior to the global financial crisis, Canada was back there within about 2 years. Okay. And so here's the big difference that happened: the affordability of housing in the United States is actually improved as a result of the global financial crisis because prices got so depressed for such a long period of time. The income to price ratio in the United States has always been significantly better over this last decade because of that significant depression. Whereas us here in Canada, we had a bit of a blip in pricing, but not a long term depression. And we just carried on in this significant appreciation, whereas wage growth has pretty much mirrored what's happened in the United States. So, from what I'm seeing, reading, and hearing, what's happened in the United States is they haven't yet felt the same impact at the household level that we have felt in Canada for all the reasons I just explained. On top of that, when you get a mortgage in the United States, you can actually lock in that rate for 30 years, right? That's a 30-year mortgage, 30-year term, 30-year amortization. Whereas here in Canada, you can get a 30-year amortization, but a 5-year term, meaning every 5 years, in the most part, you're going to have to renegotiate. And people are seeing that jump in interest rate and jump in payment. That same thing has yet to be felt to the same extent in the United States. So for these reasons, the US is doing a little better. For that reason, they're talking about holding rates higher for longer, which again means that over here in Canada, we're doing the same. But there's a lot of discussion in the world of the gurus and the economists about how much longer we are going to be coupled to the United States in terms of lockstep decision making, or are we going to divert? There are a whole bunch of other issues around that regarding currency devaluation or appreciation, rather, and therefore making our exports more expensive. But this may be a period, this next year may be a period where, at the government level, at the BOC level, maybe they reconsider how much we follow and copy the United States.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I know I was speaking. I spent some time with one of our good friends, and Quentin. He owns hundreds and hundreds of units through apartment buildings and so forth. And I got asking him, what let's have it, Quentin. What would you do, or what could you introduce, or be a little bit different to our financing world and to the lending world? And he thought, maybe it's time we look at those 30-year terms, what they have in the States, and just trying to think outside the box. Because as you and I both said, we keep doing the same thing over and over again, and we keep running into this issue. So, and I know, of course, the U.S. has different set of financial roadblocks and hurdles, but maybe it's something that we'd start discussing from
Look,
lending's
I think
perspective.
we're in an environment where we cannot close the door to any option. All options should be on the table in order to create long-term housing stability for Canadians, right? So
Hmm.
if that's something that might work, give that stability, make your decision today one that you can stick to. Another really interesting thing, Gary, that came out of the United States shakedown in 2008, there was a lot of predatory lending that existed
Yes.
in that environment where people were given effectively 1 or 2% interest rates. They believed they were going to be in that particular rate for a very long time. But these tricky mortgages in the States had an escalation clause, which meant that at the end of a certain period of time, 2 or 3 years, those mortgages jumped to 8 or 9% interest rates. And, it was actually legal at the time to do that. it was very bad practice, and they really did prey on people with low financial literacy, people who wouldn't read the contract, right? A lot of people got hurt. Now, what happened in the States after that was that if you enter a mortgage, for the most part, be it fixed or variable, there is no penalty to break your mortgage in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So you could sign up for a 30-year mortgage, knowing that in 5 years, if you have to move to a different state or whatever, your circumstance change, you end that mortgage without a penalty. We both know that's not the case here in Canada, right? We know that the Canadian banks are set up in such a way that if you sign up for a 5 year and you get divorced and your life changes within 1 year and you have to break your mortgage, you are guaranteed to have to pay a penalty. That may be something else that they should be reconsidering, Gary. If we're going to throw everything on the table and we're going to look at the states as what is good for the consumer, trust me when I say that's probably one of the best things we could do for Canadian consumers when it comes to interest rates and mortgages.
Yeah. And let's also remind ourselves too, 8-ish years ago, 9 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago after the financial crisis, believe it or not, and this is how short-term memory works because we forget, many countries came to Canada to learn about our financial bylaws and policies and so forth because we were able to sustain that financial crisis. Albeit this is maybe where it has become exposed. So I truthfully I truthfully do believe with a few tweaks, we can right the ship. And based on a lot of the things that the world economy came to us to figure out, well, what are they doing? Now, granted, the low interest rates has driven, quite frankly, in my belief, has driven up valuations. So
Yes.
so let's use that as a learning